Here's two other names that they won't ever say. Put them on the bottom of the screen, please. Two names that they'll never say, Cloward and Piven. If you are watching with the DVR and you don't know what Cloward and Piven is, I want you to pause this show right now and go Google it. Google it. Pause. Please look it up. This is important because Cloward and Piven, the Cloward and Piven strategy, it's what they're doing. They're collapsing the system and replace it with a system of guaranteed annual income for all the workers. Workers of the world unite. They need to do it this way. They need to do it in the cover of darkness. They need you to not listen to me. Because if you start to listen to me, you're never going to willingly give up your freedom. It is about one person, the rich guy, paying more than another guy, the poor guy. He'll pay less. They call it social justice. They call it fair. They call it anything but what it is. Marxism, spreading the wealth, leveling out the playing field. There's one thing you cannot call any of these plans. You can't call it America. Can't do it.
You alluded to the fact that Glenn Beck has made your beliefs a bit of a political football. Would you say that's legitimate?
It's just silly.
Is he accurate? And what would you?
Well, no, of course he's not accurate. Because in his view, the reason for all sorts of developments in American society over the last 40 years are in that article that you have there. And in fact, that article was as much a reflection of things that were already happening in the society as it was a plan, a design. It was partly a plan, a design, but it was a design that tried to take into account, to register currents that were already unfolding in the late 1960s. But even taking that into account, that article, in his diagram, he attributes all sorts of developments, from Acorn to Obama to the financial crisis, to these ideas, to an article published in a little magazine. He's looking for a scapegoat. The idea is to say that everything would be nice in American society if it wasn't for these Columbia professors. He always calls us Columbia professors. And if it wasn't for their nasty scheming, no financial crisis. Can you think of anything sillier than to attribute the financial crisis to an article published in a low circulation magazine in 1966? So it's an old technique of right-wing ideologues, finding a scapegoat, somebody preferably who is not a foreigner, right, an intellectual, and attributing things that go wrong in American society to somebody who's foreign or dark-skinned or an intellectual.
Okay.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. Radical implementation involves pushing for substantial change while learning what the powerful will concede. It typifies a distinctive alternative model and strategy for progressive social change developed by Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven in the 1960s and 70s to address the issues of social welfare. It successfully combined a politics of survival that helped people in confronting the concrete, practical, economic, and political struggles they faced in their everyday lives with a politics of social change that laid the groundwork for moving beyond the limitations of the existing social order. Cloward and Piven's combination of scholarship and political activism in the field around this model was the most important and influential of the 20th century. And it remains to this day one major way a critical left can still be politically relevant in the face of entrenched power. Our guest today on The Radical Imagination is Sanford Schram, professor of political science at Hunter College. He's the author of 6 books, co-author of 8 others, and author or co-author of well over 170 articles. He's the only person to have twice received the American Political Science Association's Michael Harrington Award for its critically acclaimed books, Words of Welfare and Disciplining the Poor. His research and scholarship has focused on the politics of welfare, poverty, and the subjugation of subordinate populations in the United States. In his writings and activism over the decades, Sandy's been one of Cloward-Piven's most ardent, articulate, and enthusiastic supporters. So, Sandy, thank you so very, very much for being here and doing this show. It's an honor, and it really is a blessing to again go back and talk about these 2 remarkable individuals and your place in all of this as well. So,
well, thanks for having me, Jim. I'm glad to be here.
Great. And I thought I'd start with, I know you're familiar with the 3 articles Josh Miller of Smith College did with Richard in 2000. And here's a short little excerpt from that introduces you. So Miller is asking here, do you feel that you have other people who are in a sense descendants of you intellectually or cousins? Or do you feel that you and Francis are really occupying a lonely niche? Richard responds, well, we felt that way for a long time. Francis says, and I'm inclined to agree, that the climate is turning a little bit. And then Josh says, you did feel lonely for a long time. Dick, yes. We're always the object of attack. But for some reason, there is some evidence that younger people coming up in political sociology and so forth are looking more kindly on us and saying we need to go back and pay more attention to disruption. Are there writers who you feel are simpatico with you, who are writing in sociology, social welfare, or community organizing? There are some. There have always been a few. Are there any in particular? I was just wondering if you felt particular kindred with any. And here you are. You're on a very short list, Sandy, of 1. This is Dick. Sanford Schram. He's at Bryn Mawr. He's writing a book about us. It is pitched very much toward policy disputes and conflicts. That is an incredible honor.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, I mean, you were singled out and as the guy, the scholar, the activist, the writer that is doing the sort of work that would get the general public to more appreciate and understand what their ideas were. So how did you get all involved in this? How did you
Well, I originally met Francis and Richard at academic conference, the American Sociological Association meetings. It was in 1986. I forget whether it was in Washington or New York. It was one or the other. And it was a great opportunity to meet them, having read their work as a graduate student and relied on their work in my early writing as a professor. And I don't know, we just hit it off. And my wife and I became very close with them, and we would visit them a lot, and we would they were my mentors, even though I never studied with them, and they continued to advise me and encourage me. And at the time that Richard did those interviews, he already was not well and had been diagnosed with cancer, and I was working on a book about Richard and Francis and trying to suggest how their work could be relevant for getting change in an era of entrenched power to be everlasting. And I talked to Richard a lot on the phone as I was writing the book. And so to hear all of this again, all these years later, where I'm no longer a young up-and-coming scholar, it's all very moving for me.
Is this the book, Your Praxis for the Poor? Is that what you were?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Richard advised me consistently throughout the writing of that book.
Terrific. It's really magnificent. I've had it a number of years. I've looked through it and reread it, parts of it for our interview here. So yeah. So this is personal. This is political. This is part of your DNA as a scholar, as a professor, and so on. And so, why do you think this was so? What makes Cloward-Piven so controversial? Their strategy, and give us a little bit of a understanding of the history of welfare in this country. I guess starting 1935, Social Security Act, what happened in 1996 under Clinton, and so on. If you can hit some of the high points and then try to give our audience an idea of why this strategy, this model is so incredibly important. You call it radical incrementalism. So why has it become so important for you, and how's it different from other models?
Well, no, that's a great question. So one of the ironies is that Piven and Cloward, early on, when they published an article in The Nation where they outlined what they came to be called the crisis strategy, to sign up as many people who were eligible for welfare, that would overload the system, and we would see just how great the need was, that it would create pressure to move beyond the crisis to, say, like a guaranteed income. And Congress did vote on a guaranteed income twice, though it never was enacted. They came really close, though the Nixon plan was far less than what the welfare rights organization under the leadership of George Wiley, with the advice of Richard and Francis, wanted. The crisis strategy was real, and it echoed in the halls of Congress. And we almost got like a basic income guarantee, things that people still talk about today, and are reflected in elements of the Build Back Better plan that Biden is proposing as president right now. So they're one of the few scholars across the political spectrum whose work was profoundly relevant to contemporary politics. And I think one of the real ironies of this was that they got demonized because they were so effective in mobilizing the disenfranchised and the subordinated that could disrupt the political system and get change. And so that was largely from the right. From the crisis strategy on, they were seen as incendiary, Molotov cocktail throwing, bomb throwing leftists. But they also, over time, as Richard, I think, was intimating in that quote, were criticized from the left because they were willing to work with the existing system to exploit opportunities to participate in electoral politics as well as protest politics, and to actually articulate a relationship between protests that would create a crisis with getting electoral change and policy enacted. And so they get criticized across the board from both the left and the right. And that's why they were criticized as radicals and they were criticized as incrementalists. And so I felt obligated eventually to write about what I called their radical incrementalism, where, yes, they were willing to participate in the existing system and try to get incremental change that would lay the groundwork for a broader transformation. And I think no other scholars over the last 100 some odd years have so effectively combined theory and practice. And that's why I called the book Praxis for the Poor. And they're models for how people can be activist scholars whose work is dedicated to making a difference. And they are, and Frances is still with us, and I talk to her all the time. They're still at it. She's still at it. And Richard's memory of how much he inspired me is still with me as well.
Actually, Frances is doing a webinar tomorrow, Thursday, on the 18th. So she is very, very active. We're taping this on the 17th. Wow, there's so much to unpack there, what you've been saying. The fact that so many academics and scholars have, in a sense, used the data or have elected, chosen, studied issues of social welfare from the top down, right? Richard and Frances was about looking at and offering voice for the voiceless, for the poor, for the disenfranchised. That was absolutely central, always has been, always was, to their concerns. That was the ultimate concern there for their writing. And yet, as you point out over and over again, the importance of their scholarship and how it was good social science and sound political strategy as well. And I think it's so important how you point out that scholars can be activists without compromising their intellectual integrity. So why is it so important to make that point? And why have so many academics failed in that undertaking in terms of whatever, being more concerned with their careerism or working within the system, challenging it, and then, in a sense, becoming beholden to it somewhat. But the Monahan model is another one that you talk about considerably. So there's a lot of things to try and put together here, isn't there?
Yeah, no, that particular topic is one that is pretty controversial in itself. There's a lot of leftists in the academy. I think it's laudable that higher education, colleges and universities in the United States over time have opened their doors to people on the left. That wasn't always the case, say, 50, 75 years ago. And there are a lot of leftists in the academy, in the social sciences mostly, though they're still a minority. I mean, I think most social scientists are, say, more moderate in their politics and more liberal. But there's a critical mass of leftists. And I think a lot like on the right, I think there's a bit of tribalism, and people are preoccupied with virtue signaling and trying to stay pure to the cause of whether it's Marxism or socialism or what have you. And they don't want to be seen as a sellout or a cop-out or someone who's going to compromise or clip their political wings in order to fit in to the existing political system. Of course, that means they're going to be largely irrelevant to trying to get change in politics today. And so this is something that Piven and Cloward, who were being demonized as these bomb-throwing radicals from the right, were not deterred from. They were willing to get involved in politics and try to extract concessions from those in power, which means that they could be seen as selling out or compromising. They were never deterred by all of this. And so Frances, I think, has accurately characterized their work as the work of people who identify as radical Democrats, right? So they're not communists, they're not Marxists, they're not people of the extreme left, they're radical Democrats. They're people who want to push the democratic process as far as possible. But they're going to be involved in that process. They're going to register people to vote, as they famously did through HumanServe. And they got to stand behind Bill Clinton when he signed the motor voter bill. to require state departments of motor vehicle and welfare offices to register people to vote, to increase the turnout of people who very often didn't participate in elections because they were too poor or too busy or didn't have access to the ability to register easily. And so they would get incremental change like that could make a real difference. And so they didn't say, oh, we're only going to do protest politics. No, they were going to do protest politics and with an eye to getting people involved in elections to make real difference. And so that's the distinction. I think they were not going to be deterred by whether they have to somehow virtue signal or maintain their political purity or not compromise or only be loyal to the left. And I think that in and of itself distinguishes them from most other left-wing academics in a way that is extremely laudable and has proven to, and Richard and I talked about this when I was writing the book, has proven to lead to massive improvements in the well-being of people on the bottom of the socioeconomic order.
That's the month. No, and they're almost unique in this, in a sense. I think you do, in the chapter, refer to them as neo-Marxist, but who worked under with the dialectic in mind, pragmatic in a sense. They didn't have, you're right, they didn't have some grandiose blueprint, grand systems model that they were going to try to impose. They're very, very much down to earth, and yet they go back and forth to the theories, to the strategies, to what they found the situation was for real life people, poor people, what they were saying, and so on. I really can't think of too many social scientists of that period who was doing that sort of stuff, right?
Also today, I think it's even more dramatic.
Yeah, unfortunately.
There are in many ways role models that many academics on the left feel they can't risk emulating because of the pressures, as you said, to jobs, to get tenure, to get promoted, to be seen as a legitimate scholar. And so the climate has gotten chillier, but their model still shines out there for us to follow.
And they weren't afraid of taking chances. They realized their chances of overall success as they pushed for a much more progressive society and culture. They knew this was going to take time. So these brief moments of disruption, of creating this sort of push of the census politics were very fleeting and very important to take advantage of. And again, particularly in social work and sociology, they met with very stubborn scholars and colleagues who insisted that it was mainly about what they should be about is organizing rather than mobilizing, organizing into mass-based permanent organizations rather than taking advantage of these brief moments where the poor can get something, even though realizing there will be a backlash as well. Could you sort of flesh that out a little more?
Right. So that was another debate at the time where Piven and Cloward were criticized across the political spectrum. So this particular debate was not so much about their first book, Regulating the Poor, as much as I think it's their third book, their second monograph, Poor People's Movements, where they emphasize that too much has been done to try and organize people on the bottom of the socioeconomic order, and that the only way to get real change is through organization. And they argued instead that that would just reduce people on the bottom to try and compete with the existing organized system of interest group politics, and they would lose out because they don't have the resources to compete. So the poor's best bet was on creating disruption and withholding their participation in some broader consensus, to practice a politics of dissensus, as you said, and disrupt the existing state of affairs to the point where a crisis can be created and elites feel obligated to make concessions to try and reestablish the order and the normal course of events. And and they took a lot of heat because they were saying, oh, well, you're discouraging poor people from organizing. And that's not really true. I mean, I've talked a lot over the years with Richard and Francis about this. And Francis in particular still insists that, right, it's important to say, well, she wasn't against organization per se. She was interested in organizing to facilitate mobilization and the participation of people on the bottom in mainstream politics to effectuate change.
Yeah.
So a good example is the civil rights movement, which Richard and Francis had an article in the week after Martin Luther King was assassinated in the New Republic at the time about how people were in many ways sort of like killing Martin Luther King all over again by suggesting that he was someone who was trying to promote consensus, when in fact he was practicing a politics of dissensus. And so, in other words, what is the legacy of Martin Luther King? Is it that he organized the poor and the dispossessed and non-white people, African Americans most especially, or did he mobilize them through protest? And I think that that's an important debate. And we see this now that with Biden. And I don't think anyone is saying we have all the answers or everybody knows exactly what the right strategy is. And one of the things about Piven and Cloward that was so courageous really was that they were willing to say, well, it depends on the circumstances.
Yeah. Contingency, right?
At any one time. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, we talk about politics of dissent is a politics of contingency.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by that? And then just to make a quote here from Richard, as they were promoting progressive social change through dissensus politics, they did so knowing the alternatives could be worse. We, quote unquote, we knew that trouble was coming. Our view is that the poor don't win much, and they only win it episodically. You get what you can, when you can get it, and then you hold on to your hat. Yeah,
that was a great quote that came from a New York Times Sunday magazine profile of Richard and Francis around the time I was writing the book. And it was great to see that profile. Richard, of course, at the time was not well, and so we were all very excited about that profile. And yes, that what Richard said really nails what they were about. So welfare reform was the reaction. They knew backlash occurs, that politics is not linear, developmental, progress is not guaranteed. Politics is very often one movement countering another in a dialectical fashion, as you suggested. But hopefully, it will ultimately bend towards justice, as Martin Luther King suggested. And so they recognized that by getting a lot of people on welfare and creating a welfare crisis, welfare mess, as Nixon called it, that over the long haul, people would want to try and retrench welfare, which is what happened. But that's just as it is. That's the real world of politics. So one movement countering another in a cyclical fashion. And what you do in response depends on the circumstances in which you find yourself at one point in time. I mean, it is in that sense very Marxist at the theoretical level, which may mean that Marxism at the practical level maybe is not as strident as we often make it out to be.
You could be involved in praxis more than Marx in changing the world than perhaps Marx himself did. I think that was a very important part of their strategy. So, by the way, this strategy can be used and should be used by other social movements as well. This is a model that doesn't just apply to welfare rights, correct?
Right. No, and I think it has, and I think so. So in the book, it's really interesting. We're talking about this book now. That I wrote this book like several decades ago, but so
Very relevant, practical.
yeah. So at the time, right, it was becoming popular, and I've written about this a fair amount since then too.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've really had to dwell on this again and again. So it's a common thing for people who want change to say, well, maybe if things get bad enough, then finally we'll have enough people concerned about it. Or like if the opioid epidemic or drug addiction epidemic spreads to the suburbs and affect other people up the socioeconomic ladder, we'll get change then. So this is what I call the bad crisis strategy. So it's like a perversion, a bastardization of what Piven and Cloward were talking about. I don't think necessarily Piven and Cloward were saying, well, more people need to suffer so that we can get change. In fact, they were saying if we can get more people benefits and overload the system, then people will realize the real costs of poverty and suffering in our society, and then we'll get change. So I think the bad crisis strategy is unfortunately too popular. The bastardization of what they were saying is too popular. In other words, let's make everything worse. So on the left, the far left today, for years actually, is a school of thought. It's called accelerationists. So accelerationism is this idea that if we accelerate the contradictions of capitalism and they intensify, the whole system will implode that much faster.
Right. I think Marx referred to that as what our Dick referred to that in class. It's growing immiseration.
Right.
And
right. And yeah, so
I'm not.
You see this again and again, this kind of thing. I call it the bad crisis strategy. Like say like with COVID, or unfortunately, or any kind of intense crisis. I don't think that's necessarily the case, especially if the people of privilege can insulate themselves from the problem, right? And then there's no guarantee that the people who really have access to power are going to be more amenable to change.
Right.
And so I think we need to be savvy about this. What does it take to get change? And to what extent do we need to recognize the importance of thinking contingently, given the lay of the land within conventional politics and what is possible?
But you're right. So you do need to take in this possible societal reaction, which can be vicious, and that gets us into the real core. Why is it so difficult to create a culture, as Richard would say, and Francis, the highest calling of a government, say, is the welfare of its people, and it's been tossed around, it's been distorted. Well, there's deserving poor, there's undeserving poor. The work ethic is destroyed by it, and Cloward-Piven also again pointed out that welfare was a secondary institution, in a sense, in service of the larger economic political goals of the parties. Correct? And if you could explain that.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point.
It is, and then we could maybe segue into your own work and talk about the neoliberal answer or response, the market response by the Clinton administration to welfare, the privatization of it, in a sense, that you've written about.
Right. Yeah. So, I think it was earth-shattering when, in their first book, Regulating the Poor, Piven and Cloward said that welfare was a secondary institution that largely operates according to the needs of the primary institutions of the state and the market. And it served political and economic purposes, and it alternated in which they gave more emphasis to, depending upon the contingencies of the time. So when the poor were complacent, welfare was very conservative and emphasized achieving economic purposes by enforcing the work ethic and keeping welfare benefits below the lowest paying jobs, and encouraging the poor then to have to go take poverty enduring wages as their means for surviving in our society. And when the poor were disruptive and causing problems politically, then elites were more open to liberalizing welfare to cool them out and recreate the conditions for political stability. And so welfare very much was buffeted by the circumstances of the time, and it alternated in serving economic and political purposes as a secondary institution. And I think that's very important because at the time, people were seeing welfare either as this irresponsible handout or a generous program to help people. A lot of people in the fields of social welfare and social work, sociology and political science and so on, we're thinking in historical terms that welfare is much more liberal and beneficent than compared to the poorhouse of yesteryear, and that things were getting better. And Piven and Cloward were pointing out, well, no, history is not like that. It's more cyclical, and it's contingent upon the circumstances in which we find ourselves, and that we can't look at welfare just on its own terms. We have to see it as a secondary institution embedded in the political economy and how it alternates in serving political and economic purposes. And this was a much more critical minded perspective about social welfare than most social workers and people who studied social welfare had at the time. And it was incendiary, the way it kicked off a very volatile, controversial debate that went on for years. It's very rare that a book can do that and do it for decades. And I think, in the age of neoliberalism, where since Reagan on, we could say that the neoliberalism of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and people like that is still with us, where we've turned away from emphasizing the politics of it and trying to build a welfare state, and we're more interested in the economics of it, and to the point where the state now, rather than countering the market, say like under Keynesianism, it's been replaced by neoliberalism, where the state buttresses the market. And so now, for instance, in welfare now, it's like the client is changed. Under Keynesianism, welfare countering the market, the main client was the recipient. And we were going to try and help them survive given the inadequacies, the vagaries of the market, not creating enough economic opportunity for them. Under neoliberalism, the main client is the employer, and the welfare operates to get the employer more cheap labor, right? And so this is Piven and Cloward perspective, a more cynical political economic perspective, enables us to see this about how neoliberalism operates in this way, hopefully creating the conditions for us to resist that. And you started to see this even with Biden, as moderate as he is, no flaming radical by any means for much of his career. He basically wants to abolish welfare like Clinton did, but now from the left. He wants to go to the child tax credit, which would cut poverty more than in half, which would basically give people a guaranteed income without conditions that would not tie welfare serving political and economic purposes in this highly neoliberal way. And so, yeah, I think in the book, Practice for the Poor, I emphasize that Piven and Cloward taught me that the solutions to welfare and poverty lie outside of the welfare system. You can't fix those problems by tinkering with welfare. So radical incrementalism might involve taking small steps, but to get beyond welfare. And to some extent, I think Biden has learned that lesson. From me, but he's learned that lesson.
Yeah. So you do see him somewhat shifting from more paternalistic market mentality of Clinton.
Oh yeah, I think this may hurt the Democratic Party in the short run, though hopefully it will lead to their success in the long run. But Biden's Build Back Better agenda is a radical break with neoliberalism. And the idea of, in particular, just one example, of conditioning benefits on work, and that you must be compliant and participate in low-wage labor markets and so on. And this is what's got Joe Manchin so mad, right? He's against it unless there's work requirements, because he doesn't want to, quote unquote, create an entitlement society. But it shows you that Biden is bucking the system that ties welfare as a secondary institution to the political economy to serve political and economic purposes. He's going, no, just give people money. And the idea they'll thrive and they'll be better off. And we'll be better off because of that. And this is a breath of fresh air, which I don't think Biden thought of on his own. It comes from the more progressive elements of his party, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, AOC, so on and so forth. But it is definitely an opportunity to move beyond neoliberalism, which may hurt them at the ballot box come next year and in 2024, but hopefully over time it will redound to their advantage.
And I haven't also heard, because again, that's a big part of what Cloward-Piven and Piven were talking about too in terms of welfare, the scapegoat role that the poor serve. And the drama that's being played out, the need to humiliate, to disrespect welfare queens, to make it racialized, as you point out, and use those dog whistle political terms to win votes. To his credit, I don't see that occurring in the Biden administration, and I think you're very right in that he's been listening more to the Bernie Sanders, the AOCs. And I wanted to ask you, perhaps Reverend William Barber in the Poor People's Campaign, and what you think Francis and Richard would think of that movement, that campaign.
Oh, I think, Francis has talked about them and totally supports Barber and Theoharis and the others in their effort. And that's exactly what we need. As you were saying something before, that's very important, because these protest movements are designed to mobilize people, but also to reframe the issue, to communicate how people look at things from the bottom up. And to bring the perspective of the oppressed into the political process, and I think that this is happening, and that's why there's pushback. Yeah. Right? Again, it's cyclical. It's one movement countering another. So the most hot button version of this is critical race theory in the schools. Yeah. Right? So as we not only mobilize, but we also reframe the issue around how people are being demonized very frequently in terms of racism, characterizing the people on the bottom of the socioeconomic order as less deserving by virtue of their skin color and so on. As we push back against that, then the right says, oh no, you're trying to force feed our children into political correctness, as if learning the truth of our history is just a kind of mannerism, or a form of etiquette, rather than an education. And they at least got the first letter right. It is good a need. But and so you see this going on, that now I think Biden may, given that he's all new to this, it seems like, or maybe not. He claims he was motivated to run because of Charlottesville, and he does have a history of trying to promote racial liberalism, even though sometimes it involved hiring more police. Though that's a complicated issue too, because a lot of African American community leaders at the time of the Clinton crime bill were calling for more police in their communities. So I think sometimes we, because we lack a full understanding of the history of these things, we might demonize someone like Biden as wanting to get more racist policemen into poor neighborhoods and just crack down on non-whites. But be that as it may, I think, Biden has talked about systematic racism. He's talked about trying to address how we demonize people on the bottom, and how he trusts them to make the best decisions for their families if we give them resources, and he doesn't want to condition it. He's really proven to be someone who is willing to adopt a much more progressive agenda to get us beyond the debilitating system of neoliberalism.
Yeah, but I still think that we need to talk about the role of the police. I love the title of your book, Disciplining the Poor. Again, regulating the poor, the functions of public welfare. How do we keep people in line? How do we control? We're talking about mechanisms of social control. So at the same time that Biden may be loosening up a little bit on some of these issues, I think at the same time we need to also look at the role of punishment, of discipline, of attempting to create scapegoat groups of people who are scapegoated, wars on this, wars on that. I think that has to happen also at the same time. Otherwise, we're back in the same old, and welfare can be used as a mechanism for social control and discipline.
I published Disciplining the Poor with Joe Soss and Rich Fording, two of my longtime colleagues and co-authors. And that book intentionally is designed to be like an updating of Regulating the Poor by Piven and Cloward. And we studied the welfare system as reformed by the 96 Clinton welfare bill, the Personal Responsibility Act. And we show how welfare had been neoliberalized, where it came to be less about helping clients survive, even if only marginally, to helping employers get more low-wage labor. And so welfare is less about helping the poor and more about disciplining the poor to be compliant within the neoliberal order. And we do say in that book that what's happened over time is that welfare policy on one end of the state, sort of the left hand of the state, has moved closer and merged and clasped the right hand of the state, the criminal justice system, on the other end of the continuum. So rather than one being, as Louis Vacan calls it, the maternal side, left hand of the state, and the other being the paternalistic side, the criminal justice system, it's merged. So welfare has become more punitive and more disciplinary, and criminal justice has become more about tutoring people so that they, when they get out of prison, they don't come back, like through reentry programs and so on. And it's kind of scary when you think about it, that there's less of a distinction between welfare and criminal justice. A good example are like drug courts. So they proliferated where, in lieu of having your case tried as someone charged with a drug offense in a conventional court, you can go to a drug court where the penalty, the punishment is not going to prison, but therapy. But if you see how that's done, the therapy is often done in a highly disciplinary, punitive way that if you don't follow the rules very strictly, they throw you back in jail. And to some extent, these venues, these facilities that people convicted in drug courts go to are kind of like jails.
Yeah.
And so the merging of the left hand and the right hand of the state is very clear when you see how we are shifting in treatment of drug offenses.
And Sandy, we're shifting toward the last minute that we have here, and there's so much more to talk about. Again, that privatization of the criminal justice industry with the privatization of the welfare industry, that's another aspect. There's so many more things to talk about. But you know what? I want to end this wonderful discussion with you as we started. How are you doing? How are you feeling? Do you feel, as you're carrying on the tradition here in your own work, do you feel lonely? Who are some of the people that you are communicating with that we can look at?
Right. No, that's great. So I've been blessed to have a number of wonderful students over the years who've worked with me and have gone on and done great work. And the list is really long, though I have to say, right, my two longtime co-authors were originally students of mine, Joe Sass and Richard Fording. And they inspire me all the time. And I continue to work with them.
Terrific.
Rich. And so I definitely want to single them out, along with other people like Corey Stama, my student who has an endowed chair of social justice at the University of Maryland, in the School of Social Work. She's been a great inspiration to me as well, and many, many of my other students as well.
Sandy, let's have some of them on the show too. But I'm under strict orders here of possible punishment. We're over time. Thank you so very, very much. This has been a delightful, enlightening dialogue. Thank you so much, Sandy. Thank you.
Sure. My pleasure, Jim.
Take care. And thank you so very, very much for watching us this week on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.
Decades ago, our dear sister Frances Fox Piven decided that she was going to not just be in solidarity with poor people, but she fell in love with them, which means you stand alongside them, which means you look at the world through their lens and the reality that they authorize, which is in deep conflict with the reality authorized by corporate media, by most of the newspapers and so forth. That's why she's been such a long-distance runner, consistent through Reagan, through Bush, through Clinton, and now through Obama. And now this movement is coming back again. And it's really quite a powerful thing. I think that there's no doubt that the threat of whatever, social chaos, of noise, of disorder, of discord, has always been a powerful weapon of poor people who have great dignity in their cultural and spiritual expressions. Because much of society is deeply interested in Louis Armstrong, James Brown, we can go right across the board, Hank Williams, so forth and so on. They're all brokers of Ten Commandments financially, but part of American and democratic nobility, culturally and spiritually, right? But when it comes to a threat, you see, that what they've been able to do in the last 40 years is to minimize and neutralize the threat, because you could put them to sleep, you could pacify them, keep them distracted, drug invasions, keep them distracted, make sure their music is bubblegum-like rather than deeply soul-stirring. Just keep them pacified. But the awakening is taking place, and the scholarship that Frances Fox Piven has done with many others contributes to an understanding of poor people's reality, where the threat is real. And many of us are committed to that threat. So in that sense, Glenn Beck is paying a tremendous compliment to my sister, even though he better not touch her. Tell you that right now, but it's a tremendous compliment because she is We are a threat to this oligarchic, plutocratic order, and we're proud to be a threat.
Last question and comment from you, Francis. Does the talk of Glenn Beck, do the death threats that you've experienced on your phone, on websites, does any of that have you worried?
It makes me wary when I go to remote places. Of course, I'm not stupid. I know there are lunatics out there, but does it make me not go to remote places? No. Does it make me not write articles in The Nation magazine? No. Did it stop Cornell and I from organizing this national teach-in? Of course not. We even put a Glenn Beck-style diagram on the screen in front of the audience.